Welcome to Season 5 of the podcast of the Urban Mystic. In this season, we're exploring relational spirituality, which is rooted in immediate engagement with God. It is a relational mystical spirituality, encouraging people to enter deeply into living and loving in relation to their own self, others, the cosmos, and God. In seeking to establish a relational spirituality on the foundation of our value for intimacy with God, we're teasing out the difference between our relationship to the practice of the faith and to the pursuit of relationship with God. In this episode, we recognize that the values, priorities, and practices of our doing church paradigm makes worship and the message central, with the latter the primary event. This is so for those who lead churches and the congregation, for those who attend. Yet there's a possibility of a constellational paradigm where intimacy with God stands as primary and indispensable. We'd love you to support the work of the Urban Mystic by liking this episode, subscribing to this podcast, and posting a comment. These really help out the algorithms. I don't charge for any of the work I do, and I'm entirely reliant on the generous support of our listeners and benefactors. If you'd like to contribute in this way, please follow the PayPal link in the show notes. You can also contact us via the form on the website if you'd like to get to know our values, vision, mission, and story.
Hey everyone, welcome back. It's great to have you with us again for another episode of Urban Mystic podcast. Tim and I have had some really interesting conversation. I think as we've just been kind of prepping for this episode, we've been talking a little bit about our respective Sunday mornings where we each went to go and visit a church. And we've got different reasons for doing that and sort of different reasons around what we're looking for and what we got out of it and whatever. But there's a lot of similarities there, I think. And a lot of it is just confirmation, still this sense of just kind of the institution of the church and some of the hit and miss and some of the things that we've talked about quite a bit over the seasons here. What church says that it will do and doesn't do, what it hopes that it might do but doesn't come close to. And that just seems to just pile on more and more confirmation for us. And there are a number of emotions, I think, for each of us around that. There's some real sadness, I think. There's, I don't know, perhaps it's some relief, I don't know, for me around, like, it kind of just is what it is. And I kind of have come to just expect that, I guess, from a church gathering. And it's not just the Sunday morning church. It's all of the kind of supporting stuff and atmosphere and sort of employed people often. And it's just an easy space to wade in and take some pot shots at. And we've been talking around ministry time last time, and we're going to sort of aim towards that again this time. But I thought in the general trajectory where we've talked about kind of renewal that comes into a church system and disrupts things, and then there's very much a focus, or there is a renewed focus, or there is a new, it's never been before, focus on kind of a real active understanding God is here and present and doing things, and that there's great opportunity there for then gatherings of people, sometimes called the church, to take on a new way of being, but that it often seems to collapse back into just being church, doing church, and often, I think in our experiences, is quite common. The opposite is it's very rare to find something that sticks with that trajectory of renewal coming in and things, people being perhaps more open, the church behaving differently. But the key thing is this kind of God is here, God is behaving differently. And that when that stops, the church goes back to being the church. And so we were thinking about kind of in which direction do we go to look at ministry time. And the question just struck me is, what does it then look like if we talk relational spirituality? What does that look like from a group context? Because in a way, relational spirituality is quite easy. Or it's easier to look at if it's just one person sitting at home alone. And I have a sense that a lot of people who leave church head in that direction, perhaps because that's just easier to get your head around. I can kind of go with the, well, it's just me and God, and I've just got to pursue something like that. But what I often miss is the social element of that, and that I cannot see life being made up of just, what are we now, almost 8 billion people, right? 8 billion groups of just one-on-one, just God and the other person, because we're highly social beings. And so we're constantly grouping ourselves together in formations and clusters and family units and larger groupings and whatever. And relational spirituality that ticks the boxes for one-on-one, God to me connection, must also surely tick the boxes around human to human and God to humans, plural, people's sort of interacting, getting together. So there's that there. And so what on earth does that look like? Like, what could that look like? We've got a good sense of where we see it not working, where it's said to be working and it clearly isn't, when there are the stories that people and groups of people tell themselves about themselves. If you believe it, it's that this is working, but in our experience, it just isn't. It isn't what it says it is. And I know that's a little bit vague, but I'm intentionally trying to stay away from getting back into this is what it isn't and this is how it's falling short, so that we can move in this question of what would a relational spirituality look like? And that's where we've been looking at ministry time. What might that look like from a group setting? And I think there are a few levels that we can explore. There's kind of one-on-one, that's me and another human being connecting, but an idea that there's a relational spirituality that we have to just talk mathematically. There's three persons, me, the other person, and God as person. And what might that look like? And then you go a little bit bigger than that. There's groups, intentional groups who meet together for, a certain reason, perhaps for a certain time, over a certain timeline, or meet indefinitely. But again, there's this idea of if God really is a person that shows up or doesn't show up, what does that look like in a group of 5 or 10 or 12 or whatever it might be, taking that into account, that it's not just human beings that gather in a very much a flat human-to-human interaction relationship, but there is both the horizontal and the vertical. And then the larger group, which is for me like the real question, what does that look like? And I think that's partly why, we talk about ministry time, because I think we're trying to understand and just break apart into its component pieces and try and get a better sense of what that is, because the church has always called that ministry time, as if, if you say you do this thing called ministry time, then it means there's a large group of people and they're meeting with God. And I just don't think that one and one doesn't make two. Often not, maybe sometimes, perhaps sometimes accidentally, but not from we're doing this intentionally and it's always working out to be that. And so, Tim, I think you have a lot more experience than I do in a larger corporate setting where there is more of an attention towards people meeting with God. And that's why that question just fascinated me, to just kick it back to you, and that we can just talk through, what the hell does that look like? How would you look at? How would you go about hosting a space like that? Because I think there's potentially some of that, but I also want to use the language in a way, with older language, but like stewarding, because places like that have to be nourished, and there has to be some intention around what's happening there. It doesn't just happen haphazardly necessarily. But I also want to stay away from hosting and stewarding, because it sounds so institutionally language of, there's a few people in charge, and that's not what I want to look at. I feel, what is it where there's a group of people who are gathering for a similar reason, who all sort of hold their own locus of control internally, their own agency around what's happening. And part of that is the high value for, we meet together and we meet together with God. And perhaps that means there are individual moments of me and God in amongst the corporate us and God. But how does that actually, if we had to script it, which is perhaps the wrong way to phrase it, what would it look like?
Order of service, really. I mean, I think,
yes, well,
I think
you're right. I'm asking about liturgy.
yeah. Basically, sorry to interrupt you there, but I feel like you're jumping around the same thing there, of basically saying, there's when people gather to do church, they do certain activities and they do them together and often in a particular order. And so what does this then look like? I feel like in answering this and in grappling with this, that we possibly need to take a step back. And I want to acknowledge that we've got this mystagogic culture that basically makes faith central, and God is this mystery who's known. But how do we primarily know about God? How do we primarily know God's will? How do we primarily know who God is and what God is like? And the answer to that is the Bible as it is presented. And during renewal, that changes, because in this environment where people are making the Bible and meeting about God and teaching central and faith central, there's this experience that God draws near and speaks to you. You experience God's attention and God's activity. And then in that environment, people start doing church differently. People arrive at church with the intention of meeting with God, and they'll put up with the worship if it's crap, and they'll put up with the sermon if it's crap, because they want to meet with God. And God kind of goes, yeah, it's both, and that draws near. So that's cool. And then people that are doing ministry end up being excited because you've been doing church, and then suddenly God's moving, and this changes your experience of ministry. You come alive that this is what you're called to, this is what you live for, this is what you want church to be about. Problem is that when God stops behaving that way, often we've not addressed the underlying culture of doing church, and we've not and that experience of renewal doesn't penetrate deeply enough into our paradigms for us to question what it's about. And so after renewal, so like what I did this this Sunday is I went to a church to test my assumptions and my conclusions. And I come away observing a church like that, where I say, what is the purpose of doing church? What was the purpose of church here? And it's worship and teaching. And in that culture, we can go, yeah, God also meets with us too. Sometimes, maybe. We can't clearly tell you when and how, because it's in the mysterious inners of the individual and the appreciation of it. But we can't say that God didn't meet you because we're two or three gather in my name. And in this particular context, it was in the culmination of worship. I felt that the language really evidenced this, in that there's this worship song about how God is this waymaker and God is active and God does this and God does that. And, that's all awesome. But really the crux of the song is we're not seeing it. But that's okay, because God never stops working. We might not be seeing it, might not be feeling it, it might not be in front of us, but don't worry, God never stops working. So God's doing this anyway. And I feel like for me, that just captures the degree to which in renewal, God disrupts doing church by becoming present. And then when God withdraws, we go back to doing church, but we don't address the fundamental language and the problem of language and the problem of doing church, as in, what is the focus of doing church? It is the message. It's not the meeting with God. And so I think that's fundamentally what would look different. What would this look like in practice differently? The focus and the reason why we meet will shift from worship and the message being primary. It will shift to a culture of waiting on God to meet with God. And that would be primary. And one would make time and space for that rather than ministry time, because it shifts to then the language of, okay, well, we finished the sermon. By the way, anyone need prayer? Anyone need ministry? Cool, come up for that. But that's an optional extra. And so this church that I went to yesterday, that was the case. I felt back in the early 2000s that that's the direction we would go in. And that's where vineyard churches would land. And I feel like that's where we have landed. And we haven't sufficiently delved into our underlying paradigms and the reason why we meet. So it still exists there in paper and in the values. And it exists whenever people try to reboot ministry time and they try to reseed it. But I feel like that by doing that, God shows up, and it demonstrates that this stuff is a reality and it could be normalized, but it never quite gets normalized. And I think that's where I feel like we've actually got to dive into, where does this go wrong, and then how do we go about doing it in a different way?
Well, I just kind of I'm thinking in terms of the paradigm that you're talking through, which is very much sort of Protestant, at least at heritage, right? And I think so. I went to a church that is pre-Protestant, I think, at least. Oh my word. Church historians are going to phone up in arms if I've got this wrong, but I don't think I've got it wrong. So I went to a traditional church in which it's slightly less clear than the Protestants, I think, because in a Protestant church like that, at least the far more sort of, last 30, 50 years at least, it's very clear. You have music and you have preaching, and those are your two kind of clear spaces in which, like, there's the meet with God stuff. Whereas in the traditional church, you have a slightly more expansive liturgy, and you have these sections of areas presented all the way through from kind of the opening, which is sort of the Gloria and the praise section, through confession. And there are all these different sacraments, which is the language of the traditional church. And so you move, there is the preaching, the sacrament of the word, there is prayer time in this liturgy, and there is the Eucharist, the remembrance of, the Last Supper of Jesus and his disciples. And all of those are put forward as the vehicles through which you experience God through these different sacraments. And I'm very aware that in the same way, yet different because the approach is different, it's the same thing. That is my opportunity to meet with God, is in the, for example, if I go forward for the Eucharist, the communion, it is in the reliving of the story, it is in the taking of the bread and wine, etc., which can all be very moving and can all be very transformative in a way, but that's more where we would talk transformative spirituality. And I come away asking, okay, where was God in all of that? And in a way, God is kind of there through the things of God, but there's a distinction. And then the last element, which I found really interesting, was it was quite a vibe for like a people perspective, a little bit of a sort of a, I don't want to call it vibey church because that sounds a bit like, it was a club church with lights and coffee machines, and it was definitely not that kind of a church. It was a very old, tired church. But there was just some good people there, and there was a real buzz afterwards, and there were people just meeting with people. And I think that's the other thing. You get this kind of like, no, I'm not going to borrow Mother Teresa. That's unfair to drag her into this without asking her permission. But the sense of like, you see God in every person. So that's also a way to meet God. And I'm like, yeah, when I see my brother and sister, they remind me of my father. But it's not the same as talking to my father. So I've got a sense of like a connection with my dad through talking with my brother and sister. But it's really not the same. And so I was very aware there was lots of human-to-human interaction afterwards. But it's still not the same. And so it leaves me wondering, so then what is? And so how do we then do that? What does that look like? So would you suggest, let me put it this way, no music, no sermon, people come to a building together, that can still be, I don't want to call it church because then I feel that confuses what we're saying, but do you know what I mean? Like that would be just as valuable, whereas institution would go like, what? No preaching and music, what the hell?
On one hand, it would be good to start a secular church, a church that takes everything from God out of everything. And all you do is you have inspiring music for people to sing and dance to, an inspiring message, and opportunity for self-reflection on behavior, experience, and personal growth in that. And I think you could accomplish something similar as doing church. I think on the opposite end of the spectrum, some plain market research would really be good. If you're running a pizza joint and you want to evaluate, like what's going on, you're going to ask questions about the pizza that's being delivered and how satisfied people are with that, right? If you do the same thing with church, how are we going to ask and answer the God thing? Is it in the worship that we're looking for the answer? Is it in the message that we're looking for the answer? Is it in the quality of community that we're looking for the answer? And I think that just highlights the problem is is as churches, we don't have a clear idea of what the presence of God is. And we're not clear that that is what we do on a Sunday. That is what doing church is about. And I'd actually just say by the opposite, that because we're not clear about that, we're not clear on what we're delivering.
So then it's possible, let's say, if we look at all the elements that we put on the table, to eliminate every single one of those. And by eliminating them, you do not eliminate the option of a relational spirituality and meeting with God. So you could take away preaching, teaching, you could take away music, you could take away the Eucharist, you could take away confession, you could take away, prayer time cuts it a little close. We'd have to maybe look at that more carefully. Like you can cut away notices, absolutely. Like when Auntie's doing her bake sale or whatever, you can cut all of that stuff out. And where the institution will say, well, then, like, what are we doing? We're losing it. We're losing ground here. We would say perhaps you're gaining ground because we're clearing the. I think metaphorically, like I've heard you say before, like move all the chairs out of the way and wait on God. I'm thinking, okay, well, so if we move all these metaphorical chairs out of the way, all these things of doing church out of the way, we don't lose anything. Perhaps we gain something, and that is then the option to focus on waiting on God.
I think in many ways the problem is that ministry time becomes something in the order of service. Worship, the message, I mean, there's announcements and blah blah in between, right? But the big key building blocks then is worship, the message, and then ministry time as the maybe is how it works out in the long run. And I think that largely the problem with the idea of ministry time is that it's for those that are needy and need something fixed. Something is missing. They're desperate for something that they're not getting elsewhere in church, right? So it becomes the need box. You are dysfunctional. You are broken. Therefore, you're in need of ministry time, rather than it being normalized as a state of health. It's in a state of we're going to address a problem with you. And, if you're in a community for a long period of time, you don't want to be seen as that problem person. And the person going up in ministry time is like, geez, how many problems do they have? Right. So I think
how many times is Susan going to come forward? How many Sundays in a row before she just like gets over it and gets fixed?
Yeah. Or Dave, geez, he's confessing every week that dude's going to be so broken. He's desperate for God to fix him, and so we, like whatever, right? So that's on one hand. I think secondly, the fact that it's often hinged around the language of spiritual gifts makes it a very transactional experience. And it puts pressures in different ways because, it makes it about the spiritual superpower. And there's very few people that grow into ministry, like people experience spiritual gifts, but it's hard to say you've got something consistent, and what if God then doesn't speak to you, like it puts pressures in a different place. So I think number one, the language of ministry time is dealing with people that are broken, and it's about dysfunction is the first problem. The minute you're doing that, you're going to undercut something, because at what point do you expect someone to be at health? Is it 3 months, 6 months, a year, 5 years? Are we just punting that as a time to fix people and fix them with their brokenness? Like there you're being counterproductive on a level, because you're not saying I have a value for intimacy with God. You say I prioritize fixing people, and that's what we do in this church. Maybe sometimes. The second thing really with that is it takes a heck of a lot of confidence for someone to feel like they want to step forward and out in public behind an open mic environment to share a prophetic word. And there's people you don't want to do that. Like, let's be honest. If you've ever facilitated a public gathering, there's people that you don't want to take the mic, because you know that they can't differentiate between their projection and God speaking to them. So there already we've got something that's already going to create a bit of a tension in the community. And so there as well, the it requires a certain kind of practice, and then there's certain kind of people that are going to be rah, yeah, I'm in a gift. That means I've always got to be doing this, and this is my thing, and it's my show. And the minute we're making about spiritual gifts, we've got so many unhealthy Pentecostal and charismatic expressions that are very unhealthy and unhelpful when it comes to that kind of thing, because suddenly it goes into a certain kind of phenomenon box. I feel it would be much better if we started with the foundation and said, what does it mean to value intimacy with God? How do we prioritize intimacy with God as an individual? How do we prioritize intimacy with God as a community? When I prioritize intimacy with God, it looks like I do something. I practice this. I put time and energy behind this. So what does it look like when I do this as an individual? What does it look like when we do this as a small group? And what does it look like when we do this as a larger gathering? How do we evaluate that our value for intimacy with God is connected to the practice of the presence of God? And so what does that then look like? If we work from the foundation of values, priorities, and practices, we'd land in a very different place to an order of service or a spiritual gifting and superpower box when it came to these kind of things. Because yes, God is pouring out spiritual gifts. The charismata are in action, in during renewal. God is pouring out gifts of prophecy and healing and all that kind of thing. That's a different kind of attitude and behavior. Yes, God does change in attitude and behavior, because from renewal, honestly, we could look back and say, this divine being musters up energy once a generation for a small geographic area or perhaps a larger region if in a real push, right? But can't sustain that for very long and then goes quiet. That's one thing, just by observation as an outsider, stepping back from all the theology and that I might want to put into it, that we put into it, and all the history and the backstory. That's got to be a conclusion that we've got to come to by the way these things are happening. And if we've got a default to God is always working, oh, look, God is now particularly working in a way that we're excited by, we can get behind because we can experience it and receive it. And then God stops. And then we back to no, God is always working. Don't trust your experience. God is always working. Don't trust that you don't feel God at work. God is always at work. Suddenly we've undercut everything that we came to value in the renewal. And I feel that that's basically what we do. And it's because we're not looking at that foundation of what are our values, our priorities, and our practices. We're looking at, is there someone especially gifted here? Is God specifically pushing into this meeting in a particular way that we've got to respect and acknowledge? Or is the leader of the church excited about this, and do they find a way to push from the message into a ministry time and lead that and sustain that energy-wise week after week, month after month, year after year? I don't know if I'm communicating this well. Basically, there's a difference between individuals pushing for charismatic gifts to be in operation and a community sharing a value for intimacy with God, and they want to experience intimacy with God in the community, in what they're doing. That is the reason why they gather, rather than the reason why they gather is for what? Is it the worship? Is it the message? Is it the coffee?
A few things that come to mind, and I think that's also where I want to try and tease out the individual versus the small to large group or whatever it is, the corporate gathering. So when I look at when you talk about the brokenness, I think, okay, well, I was sitting with a couple today and telling them that often couples that sit with somebody to talk about their relationship are on the back end of the mountain. They've gone up over the top and now they're freewheeling down the other side and the brakes aren't working and they're heading for catastrophe. And that's why they went to go and see someone. There's we're broken and we're desperate and we need something to fix us. As opposed to the upside of the mountain, when I talk to people about therapy, is actually it's just a very helpful space, and it doesn't even need to be professional, although that requires a little bit of qualifying. But it's a space that you check in a very real and honest and deep way with people in a nourishing / maintenance. Maintenance sounds a little bit clinical, but kind of fashion that just talks about this is life, and this is how you do life at a deeper level. And you engage with the things that emerge within you and between you and other people, intentionally and proactively, rather than, oh, fuck, everything's falling to pieces. Off we go and try and get fixed. And that's the first picture that comes to mind when I hear you talking about, ministry time is only for the people who are broken, or, confessing things or whatever, is that then the opposite of that must be a value for intimacy, which is kind of proactive and is sort of, there's some consistency around that, but the desire is kind of like, just date nights. If I think, because I come back to this idea of a significant other sort of feeling within the relationship, is it's just, not every date night needs to look the same. You can have candles and dinner and a movie, and that's like your liturgy. Welcome, coffee, music, and a sermon. But it can be a number of different things, and those are the building blocks of good relationship. Having a value for intimacy with a partner, having a value for good, honest, deep, raw communication, sharing special moments, etc.
Yeah, practicing deep connection.
Yeah, and presence with each other. Yeah. And so then I think, okay, cool. So then, I hear you in terms of then potentially what we posit as the opposite is that. And I think we've talked a bit about those at length in other episodes around, I like it, values, priorities, and practices. I think then, okay, so the gifts then also, it's not just about kind of the what can I get out of this. And so what is the opposite? That it's not just oriented on what I can get. Is it oriented on what I can give? What can I bring to the relationship? Is it oriented on what can I bring to the group that supports the value of intimacy, perhaps? Because I think sometimes there's a patience needed and a generosity around, perhaps it's not happening with me right now, but my presence and my bearing witness to it is a part of what's happening in a group setting, even if it's not, God is not necessarily speaking or acting to me or towards me. And thinking, okay, so we get rid of everything else. What does that look like practically when you have 2 to 3 people together, or a small group, or the large group? What do we want to see? So I like how you asked the question of kind of measuring kind of the output in a way, which is, okay, well, if this is happening, then this is happening. So then what is it that we could look for? What are the hallmarks? What are the markers?
I think one of the simplest ways is what are people giving time to, and how much time is being given. So that's a good marker, because a Sunday morning service is going to take up a certain amount of time, and what people end up considering valuable is what they're going to be spending that time on. So if I take a look at a service like yesterday, they spent 8 minutes on miscellaneous activities. That's like prayer, calling prophetic words, admin, marketing, testimony, blah, 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 right? Spent 32 minutes on worship. So they gave a lot of time to worship. And in that context, some people were really worshiping and other people were bored. That's the way the usual mixture works. So even the people that are bored and not really participating are still going to endure 32 minutes of it. So in that sense, they share a value for worship, even if the way that they express themselves in worship differs, or they might be distracted, whatever, right? In this context, they spent 36 minutes on the message. The person was individually speaking for 36 minutes, which basically, in terms of priority, both in terms of order of service and priority, the message was the key thing that was being done. It was the most preparation by the professional that preached was put into that. The most time in the service was given to that. It was given priority of time and place. What did ministry time look like? It looked like 2 minutes of an open mic waiting for prophetic word. One person gave a prophetic word. they drew it in at the end as well. And then it was like, oh, if anyone, anyone, like, cool, you could come up, we could pray for you.
Before we forget.
Yeah. No one did. So if I look at that, I just have to objectively say, I'm sorry, the value and the priority was not on the engagement with God. It was on the worship and enjoyment in worship and actually the message. And that's clear, just by what the community did. I don't want to unfairly knock them, because I think what they did was good. The speaking was good, the worship was good, like the standards were high. I'm not commenting on quality. I'm looking at the underlying paradigm, and I'm saying that the paradigm and the value, paradigmatically, intimacy with God didn't shine through and doesn't shine through in that kind of context, because there isn't a shared culture of, yeah, we're all here for this, we're waiting for this, we're key. And it's kind of like, it feels like if God was going to give a prophetic word or anything, God would have taken time out with someone in the context of worship. and then when worship was done, they could come up and give it quickly, so that it doesn't interrupt too much. We're not going to spend too long waiting. Whereas if the priority was to meet with God, let's spend more time waiting. We've gone worship to meet with God. Let's give time to that waiting on God. Are people tangibly experiencing God? Is there affection? Is there connection? Because, and you see that in the context of intimacy coaching. Guys, slow down, ground with each other. Are you appreciating touch? Are you appreciating the time together? We're not rushing onto something else. We're not just looking to get onto sex or onto pizza, right? Like, are you connecting? What's the quality of your connection? Like, what are the barriers? If we've got a value for intimacy with God, I feel like we'll be giving time and we'll be looking at that.
Cool. Hang on. I want to pause you there for a sec, because there's two things. And the one you sort of introduced towards the end, which I also think is key. So then just to give that back to you quickly, the first one, which is time, is, for argument's sake, in a group meeting like that, so 76 minutes of what you describe, potentially half an hour to 45 minutes, let's say, for argument's sake, could be then actual waiting, because that would show a time investment in terms of putting the time in, right? In terms of, and I hear what you're saying. And there's a second part to that I think is distinct, that I want to just sort of raise and then sort of shelve for a second and come to as a third issue. You talk about, well, in a way, and I laugh because I've seen it so many times, and I think it's really astute and insightful. It's kind of like, well, in the worship, God is just going to take someone. It's like, I just picture this like painfully shy person walking up to someone and kind of tugging them on the sleeve. Like, I'm terribly sorry to interfere. I really am. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's completely not my place. But if you don't, please just, is there any possibility I can have 2 minutes of your time to tell you something really important? The building's on fire, whatever. So, and so that happens within kind of the music session. And I think that it's very much collapsed into that idea. But we do spend time waiting on God. We spend 36 minutes or 32 minutes on worship or whatever. And going, it's not just the time, it's how you put in the time, in a way. So you can say, well, we spent 32 minutes waiting on God, we did worship. No. Different things. So that's number 3 that I think we'll just come to. But you said barriers, and I thought that was also really, really good towards the end. That there are things that we can put in the way of intimacy, and this, I'm interested in this specifically because I think sometimes we put barriers in the way of intimacy, and then we celebrate those barriers as if they are intimacy. And so we go, well, okay, so my wife and I have been married for 40 years, and every Friday we go out for dinner together. So we've had a date every Friday, and that's why we've been married for 40 years. And you go, okay, cool. Well, look, everyone just slow down there for a second, because you've painted a very rosy picture, but I'm very interested in what happens on those dates. Like, do you talk? When you talk, what do you talk about? Where do you go? Do you go to places that are conducive for actual real connection? And do you use those dates as a way of kind of allowing things to roll on? But actually, those dates they're very effective at stopping you from connecting on and speaking about some of the things that stop you from flourishing in a relationship. So if you go to a crowded restaurant and you eat pizza and there are lots of screens around and you both take your phones, it's not a place that you can say things like, hey, I'm really unhappy with our sex life. Or, wow, the way you speak to me around our kids is just very painful for me. Or, sure, you control all the finances and I just feel as though I'm not a part of that part of our marriage. Like those kinds of relationship, whatever, those kinds of conversations cannot show up in a setting where the setting itself almost behaves in such a way to keep them out. But you can present that as, well, every Friday for 40 years we go on a date night. And you think, okay, well, just because of the passage of time, I have to agree now that you have achieved something specific. And that's where I think the barriers sometimes masquerade as the intimacy, but they're not actually intimacy. So I think that's quite insightful to go, so then what barriers would you say, like, what would you highlight to go, these are things that get in the way of waiting on God intimately?
So I think that when you give time to it, people are, as a community, because it is people that object on the basis of their experiences and their ideas and their discomforts. It's what's within them. I think that the people are going to provide the material, and it's very hard to define what that is from the outside. It's very easy to look at a different context.
When you say material, you mean barriers?
Yeah. So
okay.
For instance,
all right, cool.
So for instance, if we arrived on Sunday and we spent half an hour worshiping, half an hour on the message, and half an hour just waiting, I bet you there's going to be a number of things said about that waiting. And those things are going to be what the barriers are. And number one being possibly, what a waste of time. We just spent half an hour waiting. What a waste of time. Oh, okay. So it's a waste of time to wait on God. Okay. Why? Is that because a need is not being met? An objective is not being accomplished? Or because we don't actually have a deep desire to meet with God? And I think that largely our spirituality is in the category of self-abnegation, self-denial, fasting, prayer, withdrawing to solitude and silence. Those are all withdrawal-based things that are supposed to tame, our desires and school us in a particular way. Where is the eros? Where is the passion? Where is the desire? Okay, so we spent half an hour waiting, and as a community, we've got no desire with God. Holy shit, that's a problem in my books, right? Maybe we need to spend half an hour waiting with the humility before God to say, we have no desire for you as a community. But because we value intimacy with you, we're going to practice this. And we want to meet with you. So come meet us here in our lack of desire for you, in our boredom, in our frustration, in our fear of what you might do amongst us, in our unwillingness to be embarrassed or highlighted, and singled out in front of everyone, etc., or pushed to the front to perform and have to do spiritual gifts, right? There's a lot of stuff that can come up. The people are the content, and the presence of God is the content in that environment as well. So I think that it starts off by saying, is this important enough for us to give time to it? And the answer is no.
Yeah, I hear you.
Because the other thing that happens is people very quickly turn to, but what do you do if God doesn't show up? And I say, you sit there awkwardly.
And so, yeah, I like that. I think that's really, really helpful. So I mean that when I say that I accept the vague answer because I understand it is necessarily that, because, yeah, it's exactly as you say. It's built from the building blocks of the people who are there, and what emerges in, then I want to take it a step further and go in potentially quite a difficult and uncomfortable space, which is accepting what it is to wait upon God. So there's time to that. But if I have to think in the opposites, I imagine then that it does require quite some humility, quite some patience. I hear you talking about, I'm just talking very generally, so I'm not trying to cut the legs off what you're saying, I'm with you, but if I think generally out of the specifics, I think it must require quite a bit of vulnerability, honesty, to, as you say, okay, well, if God doesn't show up, you go, huh, well, look at me like an idiot standing here waiting for you to. In the same way, if I come back to that like date analogy, that I think that if you remove the barriers, it can be exceptionally uncomfortable to sit with someone when you can see them physically, but you don't know how or if they're going to show up. I had what turned out to be an incredibly beautiful moment with a couple a short while ago. But the building blocks of it were all like super awkward. And I just thought, oh man, I'm going to step out and try something. But I think this is going to fall flat on its face. And I was attempting to convince them to make a bid for connection with each other. And they were very disconnected. And I thought, I'm just going to try something and see what happens with it. And the building blocks are basically getting them each to sit and center for a moment and take some deep breaths. And then I got them to turn and face each other. Similar, to what you're talking about with the intimacy, the grounding sort of stuff. To face each other close enough that they could touch if they wanted to, didn't have to, eye contact, etc. And I was going to lead them through essentially just taking some of these risks of vulnerability to put out some, this is where I'm at. And the one side was for him to take the risk of telling her that he'd missed her in a season in their life recently, and for her to take the risk of telling him where he had hurt her in some things. And the first thing that happened, and I just thought, oh, this is potentially going to just fall so flat, and it really relies on the two of them being willing to go for that. And they turned and they looked at each other. And I said, you're going to just take some time to look at each other. And she just started laughing. And I thought, oh, okay, well, all right. There goes that idea. But then she kind of, like laughing with a small lowercase L. And then she started laughing with a capital L, and belly laughing. And he started to smile at her. And then I saw tears forming in his eyes. And I thought, oh, shit, this is it, actually. And what emerged was she hadn't laughed for more than a year. He had not heard her laugh for more than a year with what they'd gone through. And somehow in that connection, in that risk, it elicited this just, I smile just thinking about it, this unbelievably joyful response. But I felt so at sea without a boat, I can't even begin to tell you. And that's why I think of the vulnerability. I just thought, like, we've got to just try something, just get out there and just, like, I wasn't even on a limb. I wasn't on the tree anymore. It just felt so out there. And if it had tanked, I wouldn't have even been standing there with a mouthful of teeth. I would have just been standing there like an idiot, just going, oh, well, let's regroup and talk about something else. And that's the feeling that comes up in me when I hear you describing some of that and thinking there has to be an option to, I don't know, make a bit of an idiot of yourself, perhaps. But there's a lot of things that go into that, that I think that may or may not be non-negotiables, but I really, the humility, the patience, the vulnerability, the honesty. I think about that a lot when you talk about, well, God shows up or God doesn't show up. How on earth are you going to connect with that without some real core honesty? around, this is honestly not happening, not working, rather than faking it.
Disappointment, frustration,
Yes, yes,
longing,
yes.
all of
Anger.
those need to come up.
Yeah.
Anger. Yeah. If I've been reading and engaging John of the Cross quite a bit um, recently and really diving in. And he speaks of how there's a point where you find God so much in something, and then one day you don't. And for some people, that's a hard close, and they might never find God in that again. And with others, it's God is intermittently absent within it. And he says this is very important because is it the activity that we enjoy, or is it God that we enjoy? There's a big difference to drinking coffee on your own and drinking coffee with a significant other and connecting with them. I happen to enjoy drinking coffee on my own and with a significant other, right? I happen to just enjoy coffee, but I can separate between my enjoyment of connecting with an intimate other from coffee. I don't need to just do coffee to do it. Coffee isn't,
Yeah.
I don't want
And
to.
you can also distinguish, right, with sitting with a significant other and they're physically present and the coffee's happening, but the connection is not happening. And that's also key in what I hear you saying, right? Is if I sketch it like that.
Absolutely. And if I'm sitting with someone and they're on their phone, browsing the internet, WhatsApping other people, and I'm not having a quality connection with them, I can't go, yeah, they're with me, and they're connecting silently, and we might not be talking, but they're present here, even if I don't feel it. Even if I don't feel it, they're still here. They're still here with me. Bullshit. That is not quality connection. But God will be silent and absent in church, and we'll go, oh my goodness, oh, you King of the universe, we love you so much. Oh, your presence is so wonderful. Even if I'm not feeling it, I'm not enjoying it, and you don't seem to be saying anything or doing anything, I've got to go into my subtext, my fine print on all the ways in which you are present and active, and blah 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 blah. Basically, it's like, basically, we're not willing to admit to God's silence and absence in church. And because we're not willing to do that, we are constantly schooling people into not being able to recognize and own God's silence and absence when God is silent and absent. Because it's incredibly important that God doesn't show up sometimes. And if we can't recognize when God isn't present, we can't reliably be speaking about when God does become present. And I think that's again, when we take the emphasis off spiritual gifts and we take the emphasis off an order of service where there's ministry time, and ministry time is the focus because we're trying to fix people, that kind of stuff. The minute we do that, we take that away, we see the impoverishment of our intimacy with God.
So one of the things we could say potentially then, a group setting would be that there would be a no bullshit policy around, well, just in general, perhaps, around, I guess, who we are and who the other people are and our connection and God's presence or absence, etc. Right? But also, I want to say that there would be an agreement of a no performance kind of that thing, right? And I think that for me, there's a sense of a couple of things going on there. And one of them, it ties into the no bullshit because the performance is always that, oh my goodness, it was so amazing. Because there always has to be a great performance because that's what we're looking for that drives this thing forward. Every week has to be amazing to keep people tied into coming every week when it's amazing.
I've got to jump in here as a response quickly. In South Africa, we've got this restaurant chain that's it's a family restaurant called the Spur, SPUR, and they've got this big thing where when someone has a birthday, they get the loudspeakers involved, and everyone comes up and does this like really loud interrupting song, right, at the table, and it's a highlight, right? So I was having I was having a drink and a meal with someone a short while ago, and at every 5 minutes there was this huge fanfare as everyone got interrupted because it was one celebration after another, and there were youngsters there that were just taking the Mickey out of it because it I don't think it was half their birthday, but they were playing and milking into it, and I just got so irritated because it's the same fanfare, the same noise over and over and over, just interrupting. I was just like, oh my God, I can't do this anymore. Like, like it was nice meeting someone here. It was nice to be nostalgic, but there's other restaurants where I don't get interrupted like this, right? If we've got a gifts and a performance culture, that's what the presence of God becomes like, because then it's always a fanfare and a performance around the spiritual gifts and this time with God and dramaticus, right? That gets very tiring. And one of the reasons why it doesn't last is you can't sustain that energy and you can't sustain that enthusiasm, you know, because the 50th time you've done that same song and dance, like I can tell you it's on my nerves. Like, it's like Christmas music coming around every year. It's just too much.
Yeah, I mean, I reckon it's on and I think I've seen this from within a church system. It's on the nerves of the people who are paid to sing the birthday song at that restaurant chain. I think they hate it. And you see it, and it's reported all the time from within church systems. We hate feeding this machine that is just churning out no nutrients, and we just we're just getting paid to sing the birthday song, and it's meaningless and pointless and annoying, and we're discarding our souls every time, further and further every time we do it. But yeah, that perpetuation, right? That just like it's meaningless, but we just keep going, and there's hype and there's all that sort of stuff. And part of what the performance thing excludes, there for me is part of what I wanted to put my finger on. The barrier is it excludes the honesty, the real, the vulnerable, those sorts of tricky things. You're not allowed to be bored in a performance-driven culture of a church. You're not allowed to be confused because all of that gets in the way of the hype. You're not allowed to be quiet, unreachable. You're not allowed to be stoic. You're not allowed to be questioning. You're not allowed to be moody, grumpy, off, angry. You always have to be super happy, super smiley, super driven, and achieving all the time. Super quiet time, super prayer time, super worship time, super message, super me, super you, super clothing, super branding, super coffee machines. Everything always has to be great. And that is not real. It's just not real. There are no human relationships that are deep and meaningful, that are always super. It's just not real. And it's a direct barrier, I would imagine. And so that's one of the things that I would think you don't want that. You then want the opposite of that, which is if there is a birthday and it's enjoyable and people really do sing with great joy and enthusiasm, then you want to suck every single nourishing, minuscule little drop out of that experience. You want to be joyful and you want to be happy. If there's people who are broken and miserable, then you just want to be broken alongside them and sad and you want to grieve. If the people are confused, you want to go, yeah, I get it. I'm also confused. I don't know what the fuck is going on half the time. There's people who are bored. You go, yeah, even me. I'm bored shitless by this. Like, what the hell are we doing here? I'm standing around in a circle. I've done this week in and week out, because sometimes relationships are boring. They are. And sometimes it feels like hard work that you don't want to do, because relationships are hard work. They really, really are. And that's why I think the performance thing is easier in a way, although I think over the long term, it absolutely sucks the life out of every single part of you. It's easier in a way because it has a sense of immediacy. It's like the cheap sugar of relationships, but it's not real. And I think that stuff really is a barrier. And so if I think about the opposites, then it's not always to prioritize the hype. It's to prioritize what's real. And if you're bored, you can say, I'm bored. I mean, waiting. I've spent the the last few mornings waiting on God. And honestly, this morning I was bored. And my mind was wandering, and I was sitting here thinking, why the hell is this floor so hard? And all of the formative stuff, no, not all of it, the unhelpful formative spirituality stuff that I've engaged with would want me to pray that away, get rid of it, focus my eyes on Jesus, meditate on a passage. It's all about overcoming the boredom. But actually, the boredom is a part of it. And in that boredom, I ask the question, are you here? Is this just me? I was saying to my wife the other day, we'd had some arguments about mindfulness, which was really interesting to me. And she said, when you sit quietly, are you praying or are you being mindful, or is there a difference for you? And I said, no, as I've discerned over time, for me, when I'm sort of engaging in mindfulness, it's because I'm aware it's just me. And mindfulness is an internal practice for me and myself. Prayer is when I'm either looking for, desiring the other presence, or aware of and engaging with the other presence. And those are different forms or states of being for me. And in the boredom this morning, I thought, yeah, I just think there's nothing going on. And at the same time, within the mindfulness, I ask, well, maybe did I miss something? Am I missing something? And then I try to dial in my relational awareness and sort of, like put my radar out and wonder, well, is there something that I'm missing? But I miss that if I just pray away the boredom. You know what I mean? Like those barriers. I think I would say those get in the way of pursuing the relational thing and thinking then that must take a lot more when there's more than just one person in a room to stick to, okay, what if we're all bored? Like that's a lot of boredom, right? In a specific geographical location. 100 people being bored feels like there's a density there that's more than, like 100 people being bored is maybe like a 200 weight. And you just have to kind of go, okay, cool. It's like perhaps we can be bored. Perhaps we can lean into that. Anyway.
If two people have connected really well together and there's good intimacy, and then one person's not feeling it anymore, and then 3 months later, neither of them are feeling it, they're going to hopefully have some meaningful conversations around that. I feel in the context of renewal ending, we don't have those conversations with God. We don't go, I'm sorry, I don't feel like I'm connecting with you meaningfully. What's going on? and we end up with an environment where it's not safe for Tim. I'll own this for me because I know how hard it is for other people to do it, and that often people don't do it. So I know what it's like to be the individual stepping forward and going, guys, I think we're missing the boat. I don't feel like I'm intimately connecting with God. Yeah, I don't think other people are too. It very quickly becomes, oh, God is always working. No, I feel like God is busy on WhatsApp and is not taking my calls. This is a problem for me. This is supposed to be a time where we connect and where both parties are supposed to show up to each other. And I don't feel that God's showing up here. What's going on? Or I don't feel like we're showing up here with the desire for it. Like there's conversations that can be had that are very important to be had, and they can only emerge if we share an activity that we also know how to measure and evaluate together. And couples going for dinner together and spending the time on their phone chatting to other people, you know how to evaluate that they're not connecting with each other. And it's okay if they're doing that and that's what they want to do. Like we've all done that. But if I go to dinner with someone and I want to have dinner with them and they're on their phone the whole time, like I'm not going to be taking them to dinner again or going out again. Or I'm actually going to be addressing that and going, hey, what's going on? I came here to spend time with you. You're on your phone chatting to other people. Like, where are we at? What's going on with our relationship? And I think that in the same way, we can apply that to God. And the problem is that with the way we do church, we don't do that. In worship, everyone's very active and the worship team is very active. God doesn't have to be very active there. As long as we're enjoying worship, we can basically say, yeah, we've met with God. Same with the message. We're listening, might not be listening. Someone's preaching, may or may not be good. like whatever it is, like, yeah, cool, there's an activity happening. Right, God's there. Strip those away, suddenly we've got something very different. Is God there? Well, we can't say God isn't not, God is not there, because God is always there when the preaching of the word happens, or God is always there in worship. No, God isn't always there in worship. Not always there for the whole community even, and not always there for individuals, and it's very important that we can have that conversation.
And those are two specifically other potential barriers, I think, that are put up. And I get serious pushback when I say to people, the music in your church, the worship can be a barrier. So can the preaching. In the same way, the date nights that are only ever a movie. Hey, we just went and watched a movie together. We had a great date night. So, yeah, and what did you learn about your partner? What tricky conversations did you have to navigate together about what shared life looks like together? Shared priorities, shared goals, shared consequences for actions or inactions, whatever it might be. Like, paraphrasing somebody who I heard once say that you can take a fireman to a movie and they're full setup. Like, it's not going to change your experience all that much. Yes, there's some nuance around. You can turn to the person that you know and love, and you share a knowing smile and an inside joke. There are things like that, yeah. But it is not the same as sitting face to face and having some of the conversations, some of the interactions that activities like that block. I've felt that. I have had those experiences where one too many, just, oh man, it's been a long day, kids, etc., etc. Let's just crash on the couch in front of a movie for an hour and then call it a day. You string too many of those together, you start to realize, oh, there's some stuff missing between us here that's going on. And those are some of the barriers, I think, as well.
Yeah, but then there's also the thing you spoke earlier about. There's couples that only go for therapy when they're in disaster. That's like people going to church, quote unquote, and the language is often, yeah, but you don't, you have to be going to church to be the church, to do church. That's how you're part of. Okay, so you have to be going to therapy to be in a relationship. That's the logic that is being applied. And then on the flip side, yeah, you only go in crisis, okay, or you go for maintenance and health as well, right? Yeah, but you don't have to go to therapy to be in a relationship, right? It can aid your relationship, but it doesn't supplant your relationship. Whereas the way we use the language of church means that people aren't really the church or aren't Christian unless they're going to church. It supplants that relationship. And I think that's the other thing is we've got metrics for people being church members and present and active in church. We don't actually have intimacy metrics for people in a relationship with God. And that's why I say that what we're missing is a relational spirituality. We've got a formative spirituality. Steve, are you fasting? I mean, I'm fasting. It's sometimes because I'm not earning enough money, and it's sometimes because I'm trying to hear from God. and, but that's different. That's not the same as a genuine intimacy. Like I spent some time waiting on God today, and that just meant that I spent some time in profound discomfort, and God didn't speak, God didn't show up, and I just sat with my discomfort of like, just I'm uncomfortable, I'm frustrated, like I'm looking for you, but I can recognize that God wasn't present there to speak to me. But I will recognize when God does. So sometimes it looks like I spent 3 months pursuing God like that without God speaking. But then on the whole, as I look back, what some people speak of as a benchmark experience, as a peak experience, I can have 3 or 4 of those a year because I'm constantly looking and pursuing a deep engagement with God. And on other levels, like consistently consistently making time to pursue God because I value God's presence. I don't only want to know about God, and I don't only want to reform myself or be mindful or reflective on my own experience, my own attitude and behavior, right? I do want to do that, but I also want a depth of genuine intimacy and connection. And I'm not happy to say I love God without actually loving God like that, because for me, love includes that deep, intimate connection. That's the quality of a deep, intimate relationship. It's not a friend zone and it's not a faith zone in that sense, or faith zoning of God. God, I love you, but out there, or I hear from you, but only through the Bible. Those aren't direct, personal, intimate. There's value in them in the same way that when I've got a long distance relationship with someone, catching up in their life through seeing photos on Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApping them and getting some news, like those are good. But then we speak by voice or we speak by video, and there's a different quality of connection. But then when we get together and connect face to face and we can hug and spend that time together, there's a difference in that connection. And I think that we don't have those markers in our faith, and we don't have those markers in the practice of doing church in relation to the presence of God. We've got this one size fits all, and that's the possibly, maybe, we don't know, but probably yes, because that's what our faith says.
Yeah, I mean that reminds me a lot of kind of the last thing that I thought might be helpful to contribute there, is that it takes a sense of what I can only call right now, until I find a better phrase, and there must be some sort of relational attunement to be able to recognize, okay, I desire connection, and this is not connection, as opposed to, I've learned this. I mean, this is, there's the language of the story I tell myself about myself, or the story I tell others about, my relationship, or to even tell myself about my relationship, which is, we go on date nights, we raise reasonable kids, we, are together around other friends, we have our own space and our shared space, and whatever it is that somebody says to discuss, to tell the story of their relationship, but without some kind of relational attunement. And what I mean by that is being able to be in tune with what relational depth is and isn't, what deep connection is and isn't, what it looks like, what it feels like. I don't know if it's possible to then say, yeah, I am out of connection with my partner, with my friend, with my God. And it requires, I think, that, which I guess I would hope, or I would think that everyone has. But then sometimes I'm honestly just completely dumbstruck. I spend time with people, and the story they tell me about themselves or about their relationship is, they have great deep connection. Okay, well, when's the last time you really spoke deeply with your partner? Oh, we don't need to do that. Oh, we just watch movies and raise kids and financially contribute to a joint household, or it's like, yeah, but that's not relational connection. Yeah, we have a great relationship. And I think, no, I think it could be a lot more if you were willing to go in that way. And I think with relational spirituality, I think it requires that you are individually, and then, in the sense that we're looking at tonight, then probably corporately, you have an attunement to what it is and isn't. And when it's in sync or out of sync, or when it's happening or it's not happening. And I think there has to be that sense that's obviously got, building blocks of some of the things we've talked tonight, and probably other things, that allows you basically to just go, yeah, this is not it. As you say, take somebody to dinner and they sit on their phone, and then you go, oh, well, I'll just sit on my phone. And you both have a perfectly good evening on your phone, like on Facebook or whatever, and every now and then, check out this meme, and you go home telling the story. We had this great evening together. Well, you didn't. You had a great evening with other people and your 4,000 friends on Facebook or Instagram, or watching some YouTube videos or whatever, and you were kind of in each other's presence, but you weren't really connected. And it takes some kind of ability to tune into that and realize, oh, that isn't it. And it's a bit vague for me as I'm thinking it through, but it's the best I've got right now. I have to think some more. But there's something in being able to tell what it is and what it isn't. And I don't know if it's always honesty, because I wouldn't say that those people are, I don't think they're lying intentionally to themselves or others, you know what I mean? But there's something going on there.
It's important to have those downtimes. You can't just have peak intimacy all the time anyway. And I think one of the criticisms that is often leveled when I talk this way is people say, "Oh, well, that's what you're looking for." And I go, no, that's not. What I'm looking at is that on the whole, we don't have a high value for intimacy with God, and we don't practice it very much. And we don't have clear language on God being present and active, and when it's on, when it's off, and is that related to us not being sensitive to it? Is it, like where does that stem from? And I think that's that's terrain perhaps to go into in a bit more depth as well. But yeah, it's like this is a difficult one, because I felt a while back when I voiced it that people got the same consistent response whether they went to like a traditional church, traditional Reformed church like you went to on Sunday, or they went to a charismatic or a Pentecostal church, or they came to a Vineyard church, or whichever church years ago, as I was reaching people and directing them to churches. They consistently experienced the same thing. And the consistent response was we don't chase phenomena or experience. Doing church is what it is, and you have a relationship with God by faith. And that's what led me to conclude that we've got a faith as relationship paradigm. We don't have a relationship as relationship or a relationship as presence paradigm. And it's difficult to capture that because we've got no quantifiable metrics. And that's why I like the measurement of time. If we value the sermon the most, we're going to give the most time to it. If we value the worship the most, we're going to give the most time to it. If we value God's presence and waiting on God and meeting with God, we're going to give the most time to it. But if we say that by worship and the message we are meeting with God, then we've got no differentiation. We're not going to have any marker for the distinctiveness of God's presence and activity. Yeah, and that's where it's easy to prioritize spiritual gifts because they were distinctive. So, what does the distinctive look like? It looks like that. So let's push that. And I think no, we've got to address this at the foundational level. The foundational level is the foundation of our values and the paradigm that we have. And the doing church paradigm is about gathering people to preach to them. It's not about gathering people to enable them to meet with God.
I hear you. I think the time one is really, really helpful. And I think in terms of quantity and quality, and in terms of a lot of what we've spoken through tonight, I think is trying to point towards those two concepts, because absolutely, if you give the most time, that for me would be tick number one. And how you give that most, like you can just like grit your teeth and bear it for 37 minutes, that's like the longest time every Sunday. Yeah. But there's also the quality of how you do that. And I think that's also something we've been chasing tonight in terms of like there's dates and there's dates, there's connection and connection. And I think for me, as I want to sort of think some more on those two ideas are quite helpful in terms of trying to chase down. So what could it look like? What is the quantity and the quality of the time that you're willing to give to this? Like, will you wait? And how will you wait? How long will you wait? And what posture will you take while you're waiting? Will you be honest? Will you show up? Will you be real? Will you be truthful? Will you be open? Will you be willing to feel foolish, perhaps even be a fool? Will you be willing to risk? Will you be willing to try things in the hope? Will you be willing to hope? And not vain hope, like, well, let's just make something that's not real. I think you do have to hold out hope in relational connection, and it gives something for relationships to aim for. And there's all those sorts of things, I think, that for me funnel into this idea of, okay, so what's the quantity of time that you're actually willing to give to this? Because that's the acknowledgement of its importance and its priority. And how do you go about it? What's the quality? What's the quality there behind that? And then is it possible then to arrive at that in a way then conditions, I guess, as we've said, well, you've said, for values, priorities, then that gives perhaps the practices.
Something that you mentioned the other day as well is that you'll see a higher level of satisfaction in the context of worship when it's not just a worship team and a silent congregation. If it's the worship team and 20% of the congregation involved, that will be better than zero, but not as good as if 50% is involved. And in an environment where the worship team is possibly the quietest and the people are out singing and out participating, the worship team, you've got a very different kind of experience of worship, right? And it's the same with any of the activities. And I feel like when you've got a dead congregation and you've got someone up front trying to punt a prophetic word or push ministry, you don't have a healthy experience. But equally, if you've got the people up front and they don't want to do it, you're not going to have it as a congregation. So I think the way it is structured and the way it is participated in does make a difference as well. And that's where we've got to look at it as a holistic activity. But I think for now, and the sake of this conversation, just using the simplest metric, because that's the thing is if people want this and they want to do it as a community, you don't start with the idea of what does it look like for someone especially gifted in prophecy or healing to be doing this. How do you get there? Like if you haven't gone through that journey with God to be in the place where God's going to trust you and you're going to operate like that, right? You're not going to be doing it in a congregation. So if I've got a congregation and I've never done that and never been exposed to that, how safe am I to admit to my congregation that I've got a desire for the presence of God? I don't know what this means, but I want us to be giving time and space to this. Can we do this together? Can we share this journey together? I think that is tremendously valuable, and I don't think that we've got enough of that. I would like to more specifically address where I feel vineyard ministry to perhaps not be the answer that we've generally punted it as being. But I think I'd like to give time to that in specific episode rather than tacking that on here. Because, because I feel that's very important, and I feel like I really want to own a critique of my most formative heritage, because that's made a massive contribution to the broader church, both in terms of theology and in the contribution of ministry time. But I think that there's a contribution that we can build on. And I feel like relational spirituality builds off that immediacy of God's presence, not of God's absence. And I think that that's very important. And so to take a look at that and why I feel that immediacy is important, and to just honor and respect that, because I think there again, to value God's presence is to be excited when God is present. It's to be excited about what God is doing and be excited to joining in. Like that's part of it. And I think classically we don't have language for that if we don't share that as a culture. And so for a lot of churches, people want that, but we don't actually know what we're looking for. It's like being a teenager and not knowing how to kiss someone, not having the confidence to do it, not even having the confidence to ask someone out to go to ice cream with you or something. It's like there are those layers, and we've got to understand that those layers, those intimacy barriers between people, is also parallels intimacy issues between us and God.
I like that. If I think about your previous comment around, which I hear an invitation to people to just go try, because I think it dials back from the expert status. This could only be achieved if you are, 180 years in ministry with 300 years of study preceding that, with 80 of those spent in the personal, friendship circle of Jesus Christ in first century Palestine kind of thing. It's just so unattainable. But anybody who's ever kissed anybody else for the first time has just done that because there's a deep desire, and has had to kind of ride out, go, well, that was an absolute stuff up, or it wasn't so bad, or hey, you want to try that again, or and there is just a certain awkwardness barrier that you have to push through and go, well, I quote Brian McLaren here, we make the road by walking it. And there is a sense, I just hear that in your invitation, to be able to be brave and to be bold, but to be honest and go, this isn't it. So what would it be? And am I willing to say, hey, can we try that? I would like to try that. Who would like to try that with me? But I can't give you any promises because I can't fill in God's side of the equation. But I think I have longing, and I think God has longing. And I think that's something worth pursuing. In the same way that if you look at a couple who've been together for 50, 60 years and you're just starting out, it's silly to try and go, well, we've got to get there. We've got to jump. This is our first week of dating. Let's behave like we've been together for 60 years. It's just ridiculous. You have to just start and try and experiment and put in the time and think about how you're doing it and just go for it.
Yeah. And, for a lot of people, many people that I speak to want to know how this works and want to be able to script it and, understand how God's going to behave and all that kind of stuff. And all that to me highlights is that if we flip the trust-mistrust coin, for them, it's landing on mistrust. And how do they arrive at security? It's not by taking the risk of trusting God to draw near in person, to speak and act. It's wanting the certainty of the guidance of a professional who's been doing it for a while to tell them how to do it so that they can step up and be the professional. And I think God is often I'm going to project here tremendously. Let's see if there's any lightning bolts. I think God is often like me sitting at the table with the ministry church team doing the rah rah candle birthday song and just going, I've just had enough of this. I'm out here. I don't want to be here. And I've joked with people in the past where I've gone to church with Jesus and he waited outside for me, to join him afterwards. But I think taking the humor out of it and the jab, the jab with the humor out of it is the other thing that it highlights, is that to depart from the value of intimacy puts it in the realm of one's needs and desires rather than in the context of performance. And if we don't really want God, why are we there? Is a very important question to answer. And for some people, it's to meet people. For other people, it's to have a coffee. For others, it's because they love they want to play in the worship team. There's many different needs, and none of those needs need to be exclusive. We can have all of those, right? And that's the thing that I'm not saying please don't hear me for saying that those others aren't important. I think in a holistic framework, we're embracing all of that. I'm just highlighting that this need and desire and want for God is often lacking. And if it is there, it remains unfulfilled, because how do you know how to fulfill it? You've got to keep telling yourself that it has been fulfilled. And that's honestly just, faith is often just gaslighting, and gaslighting is abuse. So, we've got to think carefully about this. And practically about it. And honestly, the best place to start is just to say, if we wanting God to be present, we've got to make time to wait on God. And if we don't, and what comes up what comes up might mean that we don't trust God and we don't want to do this. Okay, there's an important conversation for us to have. Or it, we want, but God seems to be absent and we're upset with God. Absolutely, we need to be expressing our frustration that we desire God and God often doesn't show up. Cool. Let's have a meaningful conversation. See if God wants to be a part of that. What we're doing there is we're opening up the reality of the relational journey in relation to God, and hence it's relational spirituality rather than faith as the relationship.